So I want to start by telling you a story about when I was an undergraduate student. And I was in a political theory class, and we were studying John Locke. And there was a friend of mine, she was an Indigenous First Nations woman. And as we were studying Locke, she got progressively angrier and frustrated and angrier and angrier and angrier. And I didn't really understand why. So I asked her, what's going on? Why are you so angry with this text, with Locke? And she said, well, this man is responsible for the destruction of my people, or something along those lines. And that always stayed with me because, Locke, an important political philosopher, an important thinker, often associated with ideas of toleration, right, and of course property rights, isn't usually described as someone implicit in genocide, and the destruction of people's culture. And that's what I was being told by someone, who experienced the consequences of a way of thinking about political space that emphasized the kind of property rights that Locke articulated in his thinking. The challenge for me, I think, a challenge for me as an educator and a teacher of international relations has, I think, always been to try to get across to my students that sense of why the ideas we study really matter and the consequences that these ideas have had and continue to have on different peoples. And international relations as a subject hasn't really dealt with that type of issue very well for most of its history. It's starting, it's starting to do so more so now and over the past few years, and there's real efforts at addressing these kind of challenges, right, through decolonization efforts and diversifying the reading lists and these sorts of things. But still, the core texts don't really make it easy. I'm not saying they should make it easy, but they don't make it easy in a way that, as an instructor, is, I think, doubly challenging because students, for whatever reason, seem to naturally gravitate towards certain classic texts that don't provide the kind of critical approach to the subject that we see when we emphasize ethnicity or race or gender or perhaps class. That the classic works in the field really treat states as these imaginary persons, these units that operate out there somewhere, that work within various kinds of structures, right, that shape their behavior. And, I understand the appeal of that way of viewing the world, of thinking of the world. There's a certain simplicity to it. There's an attraction, I think, to these theories that are able to explain a lot, right, very little, kind of parsimonious theories. I get the attraction of that. But it makes it challenging for me as an educator to get across why, maybe we don't really want to rely on some of those approaches to the extent that the field might tell us, right? Because these are the classic works. And, I can pick up, whether it's Morgenthau or Carr or Bull or, Wendt, there's many others, I can name. I could go back to these texts, and a lot of them do say things that are really, really interesting, and that we should read, and we should study, and we should think about. But there's other ways of thinking about the world as well, and one of the points of these videos is to try to get us to think differently about the subject and to try to pique our curiosity about different ways in which we can conceive of the international order, and as a consequence of that, see the ways in which states and organizations and different players in the world function, right? That understand that the world might not be the way that the theories tell us it is. One of the things that I wish I was better at is telling stories. And when I teach, and when we're teaching international relations, like I think almost any other subject, what we're basically doing is telling a story. Right? We're telling a story about the world, about what matters, right? Who are the key actors? How do they speak, right? If we think about international relations and we think about some of the core texts, I was mentioning earlier, one of the texts I didn't mention, the Anarchical Society, right? We talk about the institutions of an international society, and diplomacy is one of them, right? And there's certain patterns of conduct, very particular ways of communication, right, that are unique to diplomatic endeavors, right? How we speak, how we communicate, these things matter. Who is speaking matters. If we think of another classic work, much more, relatively more recent, I guess, Cynthia Enlow's Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, right? She emphasizes in that work the role of women, right? The unseen role of women in so much of international relations, and that raises that emphasizes that point. Who is speaking here? Who are the actors that we're emphasizing? What are their roles, right? How do we prioritize different types of roles? These are the types of stories, right, that populate, that characterize the world that we're all studying. And I think one of the roles of teaching international relations is to try to get those stories across. And for me, that means I probably need to be better at telling stories.